What's up,
Hey,
Jennifer?
can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
So I was hoping to ask about some of your articulations of the monarchical Trinitarian view.
Okay.
So when you describe the difference between the Father, Son, Holy Spirit as the Father is like the source or, the fount, or I've heard a couple different words. How would you articulate the difference between his being the source of self-existence and obviously the Son and Spirit also being uncreated? What is the difference between that?
Because it's an eternal generation and an eternal spiration. So it's not a cause in a temporal sense or the way that creatures are caused. The Mormons, the Arians raised this objection to Saint Athanasius when the Cappadocians, or when he talked about cause. The Eunomians to the Cappadocians and the Arians to Athanasius, they would say, well, cause implies temporal change and coming into being when you were not. And the answer is that cause is used in an analogical sense of an eternal causing. So it's an eternal causing and coming forth. It's not a beginning with a temporal sequence of something coming to be. That's why the Son is eternally begotten and eternally generated of the Father. And in fact, this is not just my, quote, monarchical Trinitarianism. It's what the original Nicene Creed says, following the theology of Athanasius, that the Father is the eternal source of the eternally begotten Son. And then the Cappadocians qualify that and make it more specific in their writings to specify that the Father's the sole cause, S-O-L-E, and then the Son and the Spirit are differentiated by their respective hypostatic properties, the Son being generated, the Spirit proceeding.
So could I think of it sort of like how when Christ becomes incarnate in the flesh, he self-limits himself. It's not that he lacks the power when he's human to do the things that are proper to God. It's just sort of the place that is appropriate for the Son. So it's not that the Spirit or the Son necessarily lacks the power to be self-existent. It's just the order that is the most. I don't know how to
Now,
exactly
if you look at, so this is a Muslim argument. It's called the Eunomian premise, and the argument is that in order to be divine, you must have the characteristic of being self-existing or to be ase, and that's actually a logical fallacy. There's nothing about being amongst the class of things that are, quote, divine or uncreated that necessitates being self-existent, because for us, being self-existent is part of what we mean when we pick out the person of the Father. The Father alone is the self-existent one, or the unoriginate one, according to the Cappadocians. But the fact that he generates a Son and generates a Spirit who lack that hypostatic property does not mean that they can't share or don't have the same nature. So just like a father begets a son, the Son derives that nature from the Father that begot him, right, in a human sense. But he doesn't have any less of the human nature because he lacks being the source or the origin of his nature. So in the same way, you would have to demonstrate that divinity somehow necessarily requires being ase to prove what's called the Eunomian premise. And if you watch the way that Dr. Bo Branson critiques Jake, the Muslim metaphysician, in their debate, it's precisely upon this point. Another way to look at this is, so for example, we talk about carnivore and omnivore, right? To be amongst the class of things that are meat eaters, omnivores are meat eaters, but they also eat other things, right? Such as vegetables. Carnivores do not eat vegetables, they only eat meat. But they're both amongst the class of things, right, that are, quote, meat eaters. It's just that omnivores have more properties or attributes, right, that pick them out. But they're still all amongst the class that's more general of things called meat eaters. So do you see that lacking one of the properties does not mean that you're not amongst the same class? So just because Spirit and Son lack the property of being self-existing does not mean that they lack the divine nature. Because in our theology, self-existing one, or to be ase, is particularly a property of the person of the Father. It's related to the hypostatic properties. And hypostatic properties are not shared, okay? Because that picks out the Father as the sole cause, the fount, the unoriginate one, the self-existing one.
So being uncreated would be obviously all three of them. And then just because I guess
Correct.
my brain is stuck in this like temporal, like time frame, like time matters to me because I'm in time rather than being, the eternal generation. It's just kind of hard to wrap my head around. But
well, it is a mystery, right? It's a mystery that the Father has eternally generated somebody. If you read John 1, I mean, John speaks in that way, right? He says that even when Jesus was amongst us, he was eternal. He was always in the bosom of the Father. He never left the bosom of the Father, even when he was incarnate.
Okay, yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you for that. Do you mind if I ask about Hebrews 6?
No.
So I guess I would still call. I probably wouldn't call myself a Protestant still. I've been an inquirer for a little while. But speaking about sort of the idea of being eternally secure in Hebrews 6, would this imply, if it's not implying eternal security, which it probably doesn't, as I'm reading it, more.
Well, remember, these are Christians that have converted, that have been baptized. They're Hebrews. So when Paul talks about being enlightened and tasting the gift, he's talking about baptism and Eucharist. And he's talking about becoming a partaker of the Spirit. And he says, you've already tasted of the age to come. Okay? That's not a false believer. That's somebody who's really participated in the grace and in the covenant.
Yeah.
And there's a real possibility of being cut out of that covenant, exactly the way he warns the church at Rome in Romans 11. You guys can be cut out if you're unbelieving, if you're unfaithful, and if you're arrogant and puffed up.
So would this imply that if you are at that point where you have been baptized in, you've received the Eucharist, and then you fall away, that there's no coming back from that you are crucifying Christ a second time if you attempt to come back?
Well, I think that there's always the possibility of people repenting, and God's grace can reach anyone. But no, if you persist until the end, right, and you die without that, that's the hardening of the heart. That is the rejection of the Spirit, right? That's the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. So, the fact that people might fall away from Christianity and then come back to it later in life or something like that, I don't think Paul's saying that a person who doubts and disbelieves can never come back again.
Okay. And then just one last thing, if that's okay. I watched the video that you've recommended a couple of times from Orthodox Shahada about the sort of continuity between the Old Testament and the Divine Liturgy, which was very helpful, and I'm very thankful for that, by the way. It was a great video. Is there any sort of historical lineage for the sort of chanting or the way that the text is read in the Divine Liturgy? Where does that come from?
It's directly out of the synagogue, the way that the synagogue has chanters and cantors.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Those are really good questions. Appreciate that. Jacob.